This is Language Behind the Headlines by Upsize English. Hi, everyone, and thanks for being here. Whether you're listening late, early, or somewhere in between, we're glad you're with us.
This is one of those conversations that doesn't need rushing. So take a moment, settle in, and stay with us for a bit.
I'm Jen Hopper.
And I'm John Lennon.
So welcome to Language Behind the Headlines. So currently, we're surrounded by advice about rest, and yet exhaustion feels universal.
Exactly. And what makes that contradiction so striking is that it shows up everywhere, not just in health reporting, but in workplaces, classrooms, policy discussions, almost as if tiredness has quietly become a shared background condition rather than an exception.
Yes, and what's unsettling is how calmly people talk about it, because this isn't framed as collapse or crisis. It's framed as normal, as though low-level fatigue is simply part of modern life.
Right. And this is the part people miss, because when something becomes normal, it stops being questioned, even when it's clearly shaping behavior and mood.
And that's where the tension sits, because if exhaustion is universal, then it's unlikely to be an individual failure.
And that immediately widens the story because it suggests systems that never fully power down.
To understand why sleep keeps appearing in headlines now, you really have to look at how it entered the conversation in the first place. So, how sleep became a news story.
Well, sleep didn't arrive in the news as a warning sign. It arrived as a solution, something to optimize, measure, and manage so people could function better during the day.
That's right. Early coverage framed sleep as fuel rather than refuge, positioning it as preparation for productivity instead of recovery from strain.
And this is where it gets complicated because once rest is framed as instrumental, it quietly inherits expectations.
Yes, expectations about performance, consistency, efficiency, which means rest stops being neutral.
Once rest carries expectations, it becomes harder for it to do what it's meant to do.
Over time, though, reporting began to shift, not because people stopped caring about sleep, but because the promised improvements never quite arrived.
Awareness rose, trackers became common, advice multiplied, and yet surveys kept showing shorter nights, lighter sleep, more interruptions.
Right, and that disconnect is what pushed sleep out of lifestyle sections and into broader social reporting.
When you speak with people working inside health systems, large employers, and education, what they describe isn't ignorance, it's constant low-level alertness that never fully switches off.
Exactly. And that alertness doesn't disappear at night simply because devices are put away, because it's tied less to stimulation and more to uncertainty.
Uncertainty about work, finances, global events, all of it carried quietly into the hours that used to belong to disengagement.
Which means sleep disruption isn't really about falling asleep, it's about staying disconnected long enough for rest to become restorative.
And that reframing matters because it shifts the story away from habits and toward environment.
Right. Environments don't switch off just because people want them to. So when people try to explain that constant alertness, technology comes up, but not in the simplistic way it used to.
Exactly. Serious reporting has moved away from blaming screens outright because screens don't just keep people awake, they keep people reachable.
And reachability creates obligation even when no message arrives.
Because once interruption is possible, the mind stays partially online.
Right, and partial engagement is enough to keep rest provisional rather than protected.
A recurring theme in reporting is how work boundaries have quietly dissolved, especially in roles where output is cognitive rather than physical.
That's right. When work isn't tied to a place or a fixed schedule, rest loses its edges.
This is where it gets subtle because even when no one explicitly asks for more, the possibility lingers.
Yes, and the body doesn't distinguish between real demands and anticipated ones.
And once alertness becomes the default, evenings lose contrast and weekends lose their meaning.
Right, which explains why people say they sleep but wake up unchanged. When you step back from all of this, the awareness, the language, the way sleep has been framed, what stands out is how quietly the pressure has accumulated without ever triggering the kind of alarm that forces a clear response.
That's true. And what makes it harder to see is that none of these factors feel dramatic on their own, but taken together, they reshape daily life in ways people don't immediately label as a problem.
Which is why this story doesn't peak where most coverage stops, because the real effects don't show up in advice columns or wellness trends.
I've been thinking about that. What follows is less about sleep itself and more about what happens once disrupted rest becomes routine rather than temporary.
That's the shift, because once something settles into the background, it starts influencing behavior without being noticed.
From there, the consequences don't arrive suddenly. They spread outward, first personally, then socially, and eventually into places that don't usually get described as sleep-related at all.
And that's where the story stops being about nights and starts being about days.
So, what this story is really tracking?
Well, beneath all the headlines about sleep awareness, what this story is really tracking is the cost of permanent alertness.
Exactly. The cost of never fully switching off, mentally, emotionally, socially.
And the irony is that the more we talk about sleep, the more it gets framed as another responsibility.
Which quietly turns rest into pressure, and pressure into yet another obstacle to recovery.
All right, before we close, let's briefly revisit the turns shaping coverage around sleep. Let's start with sleep awareness, widespread recognition of sleep's importance.
Chronic fatigue, long-term exhaustion that rest doesn't resolve.
Cognitive load, the mental weight carried throughout the day.
Always-on culture, the expectation of constant availability.
Burnout, prolonged exhaustion affecting motivation and performance.
These words frame the story, even when the experience underneath them feels deeply personal.
So, when people say they know more about sleep but feel worse than ever, they're not contradicting themselves. They're describing a system that hasn't learned how to rest.
And until the structures surrounding work, communication, and expectation change, awareness alone won't be enough to restore it.
Which means this story won't end with better advice.
It will end with better boundaries whenever society decides it needs them.
We'll keep listening. Don't forget to follow our channel, and we'll talk again soon.